Guten Abend. Herzlich willkommen. Welcome to everyone at the Bruno Kreisky Forum this evening. Thank you for joining us. I will start as usually just explaining a little bit the ground rules because I need to explain that we will start with a bilateral conversation for about 55 minutes and then after that bilateral conversation, which sometimes is also broadcast, and this is why this is a fixed format, we can open the discussion to the audience. And so this is why I'm giving this little spiel at the beginning to explain to you how we intend to proceed. I'm extremely happy to welcome Professor Erik Jones at the Bruno Kreisky Forum. Thank you very much, Erik Jones, for being with us. Professor Erik Jones is director of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute and a member of the scientific committee of the Institute's renowned annual State of the Union Conference. He has published extensively on topics related to European politics with a special focus on political economy, very much so also on European Union integration theory and practice, I should say, and transatlantic relations. And thus, I believe it's a perfect moment to have you here, dear Erik. And we gave you a very easy task because the question for tonight reads as follows: how to prepare the European Union for the perfect storm, the new European Commission facing Trump, Putin, and the multi-crisis. So I don't expect you to answer this in 1 minute. And maybe we should start to structure our conversation and start with a little bit of a smaller question. Where do you see the main challenges for the European Union for the next mandate?
Wow. First, I have to thank you all for being here. You can tell from my accent, I'm not from around here. And I was walking through the city of Vienna today, and it's absolutely stunning. The Christmas decorations are beautiful, the weather is great. So the fact that you're in a room listening to me is high compliment indeed, because I can certainly understand the other diversions that you face. I'm also very happy to be here to talk about Europe. Although I do talk like an American, I came to Europe in 1988 and have lived here continuously since then, in all parts of Europe, except for Vienna. Somehow I have to fix that. And I'm very committed to the European project, not in ideological terms, not because I think Europe is somehow great because it's Europe, but because the European project has been such a tremendous success. It's been a success at solving an enormous number of challenges associated with economic prosperity and physical security and political stability. And although we keep talking about this multi-crisis right now, I would not even want to imagine what the situation would be in Europe economically, politically, or in terms of security if the European Union did not exist and had never been created to begin with. Because the problems that we would face would be much greater than the problems we face right now. So if I were to be confronted with the challenges that we have to face, I think there are 3 really big challenges that the European Union must address. The first is security. There is a security threat to Europe. It comes primarily from Russia, but not only. I just came back from Ukraine. I was talking with people there. I was very busy trying better to understand the security situation both in Kyiv, which is a bubble, and in the rest of the country, which is horribly exposed. And I can tell you, this security problem is real. It's not just a physical security problem, no. It's a security problem that extends into our infrastructure, into our technology, and into our media and politics. And it's one that's being fueled not just by Russia, but China has an active role to play. And there are a number of other actors that seek to destabilize our lives. So I think that that's a priority that we have to face, this security priority. We also live in an age of technological change. And the technological change is transforming the way we understand how the economy works. We have to adapt to that, or the European economy will not prosper. It will struggle particularly given the demographic change that Europe is experiencing, the aging of European society. I love living in Italy because no matter how old I get, I'm always young. And yet that's a challenge that we have to face. I think addressing that economic challenge is the second order of priority. There is, of course, a third challenge, which is that our political institutions are not working all that great. I can say this with my American accent with great confidence. There's something not going well with liberal democracy. And the diagnosis is not easy to make, particularly when the goal is to fix the problem. Because lots of people can tell you, oh, there's populism, oh, there's this loss of norms, oh, there's this volatility in the electorate. But these are the symptoms. They're not actually the cause. And until we figure out what the cause is, we're not going to be able to fix this. We're just going to ride the symptoms. And unfortunately, our institutions may not survive that process. So I think that would be the third priority for Europe to face. We have to figure out a way to stabilize and re-energize our democratic arrangements so that we can live the kind of lives that we want to lead. So I guess that's a pretty tall order of just three things. There are other things we have to talk about. Climate action, effective climate action, is probably top of the list. The reason I don't put effective climate action first is because we'll never get to do effective climate action if we don't get our security situation under control, if we don't stabilize and improve our economic performance, and if we don't underpin our political institutions. Because without those things, the more important problem will always be overwhelmed by the more urgent. And that's something we've all faced in our daily lives, where the urgent overwhelms the important. And unfortunately, that's something that the European Union is facing as well.
Thank you. You helped me structure this very much, because then let's talk the first priority and talk about security first. Do you think that the Commission has, on the one hand, the strategy, and on the other hand, the means to be working on this? Or is it obviously the whole European Union, because the Commission has only partly responsible for security issues? Are we prepared for these challenges?
So I think I think the way you phrase this question is exactly right, because one of the things that we do chronically is confuse the European Union with Europe. Europe is bigger than the European Union, and Europe has many more organizations attached to it, some of which are precisely focused on security. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, is a security institution that plays a critical role in stabilizing and ensuring that Europe doesn't face the kind of threats that we see in Ukraine today, which is one of the reasons why Ukraine is so eager to join NATO. It's also one of the reasons why we can't bring Ukraine into NATO right now. Because in order for us to bring Ukraine into NATO, we first need to establish security, and then we can extend the guarantee. If we don't establish the security first, it's not going to work. I can explain that in greater detail if you want, but just to say. We also have the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. This is what was meant to keep the peace. Obviously, it did not work in Ukraine, but that doesn't mean we should give up with the OSCE as an organization. On the contrary, we need the OSCE to be a robust organization so that we can bring lots of other actors into the architecture of European security afterwards. And then we have the European Union. And the European Union has a role to play as well. Most people don't know this, but the European Union actually embeds a stronger security guarantee than the NATO treaty does. The European Union has a security guarantee that was actually written before the NATO treaty was even negotiated, because it comes out of a 1948 treaty document called the Brussels Treaty Organization, a treaty document that was negotiated to protect those countries that survived the Second World War from the threat of German remilitarization. And that treaty has remained, at least in terms of that clause, intact over the decades. It was brought into the treaty that's called the West European Union Treaty, and from the West European Union Treaty, it was brought into the Treaty on European Union. The same clause. In that clause, which was a clause that came right out of the horrific experience of the Second World War, is what energizes the European Union. The United States would never have accepted that clause in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization because it's too strong. This is important for us to bear in mind because the United States is a political security ally. It will always insist on the right to choose whether or not to defend Europe. The Europeans don't have a choice. They must defend Europe. And so in that sense, I think we have to bring these organizations together and remember that if the United States withdraws from NATO or lowers its commitment to Article 5, Europeans have no one but themselves to rely upon in resisting these external threats. And that's what the European Union has to do. The European Union has two different sets of instruments to achieve that objective. One set of instruments, believe it or not, is to improve the functioning of the European defense industrial base. Part of the reason that the European Union right now is so terrible at providing for its conventional security is because every national government wants to have its own defense industries because they're profitable industries that employ lots of people and they represent national pride. We can't afford that kind of industrial structure anymore. We need big industries that can produce more efficiently, that can invest more in research and development, that can ensure the standardization of military equipment so that when we go to the battlefield, the bullets fit in the guns. It's really that simple. If you were to read the report that was written by former Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi, you'll find he dedicates a substantial part of the report to arguing about the need for concentration in European military industries, right? Because we need to be able to provide for European conventional defense. And if we do a good job providing that conventional defense, then we won't ever need to use it because Europe will be able to deter potential threats. That's the goal. The other instrument is about underscoring credibility. That is European Union enlargement. You see, the goal is to bring those countries that are most subject to threat into the European economy and society so that those parties outside Europe that would threaten them recognize that any harm they do to Ukraine, for example, will harm the rest of the European Union as well. And the European Union will have no choice but to respond. Like I said, Europeans have no one but themselves, ultimately, that they can trust. And so by bringing Ukraine into the European family, by bringing Ukraine's economy into the European economy, by embedding Ukrainian industries and European industries in the same value chains, we make it credible that we would actually defend Ukraine. Now, this is an argument that probably sounds very academic, and it is, but I'm not the first person to make this argument about Ukraine. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, made this argument in the immediate aftermath of Russia's full-scale invasion. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, made this argument passionately in his speech at La Sorbonne earlier this year. We have to accept that enlargement is part of bringing security to Europe. And just so we're clear on this, that argument actually holds to a certain extent even if we don't bring Ukraine into the European Union. Because look at what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine to food prices, to fuel prices, to our ability to access critical raw materials. The disruption in economic terms of Ukraine's having to defend itself against Russia's full-scale invasion was very painful for the rest of the European Union. So we don't escape the pain by keeping Ukraine on the outside. What we do is we strengthen the deterrence by bringing it in. And the European Union is going to have to do both of those things. Build up its defense, its ability to provide for defense in material terms, and then strengthen its integration with countries like Ukraine, Moldova, the Western Balkans, to ensure that they are credibly part of Europe so other countries will stop messing around with them.
So are you saying Ukraine should rather become a EU member than a NATO member, or is there a sequence to this, or how do you see this?
So the traditional sequence was that countries that wanted to, because not all countries that join the European Union want to become NATO members, right?
We know this, yeah.
I figured you guys knew this, but I just thought I would make that clear, right? The Irish also did that. The Finns and the Swedes joined the European Union without joining NATO, so you don't have to join NATO to join the European Union. But countries that are at risk typically join NATO first and then the European Union second. This time, that's not going to happen. And it's not because Donald Trump was elected president. It's because the US Senate is divided and therefore unlikely ever to provide an ironclad security guarantee to Ukraine, either bilaterally or by extending to Ukraine NATO membership in the foreseeable future. Obviously, if we could imagine a future where Ukraine is stable, it's prosperous, and it's no longer under threat of Russian aggression, then we can also imagine a future where the US Senate is going to allow a strong bilateral security guarantee to be given to Ukraine and to allow Ukraine to join NATO. But before we can imagine that Pacific future, we should not bank on Ukraine to get NATO membership. So the only choice we have is to provide a credible security guarantee to Ukraine that does not rely on the United States. And the only way we can make that security guarantee credible is if we can convince the Russians that we will honor the security guarantee and react to any aggression, and if we can convince the Russians that we have the capacity to react to any aggression in a sustained manner. So we need the enlargement and we need the defense industrial reorganization at the same time.
But we face a similar hurdle in the European Union with 28 parliaments, 27 national, and the European Union Parliament for the ratification of this kind of process. So we will.
But see, the thing is we don't have a choice, right? I mean, and here I have to say, Mario Draghi is a brilliant economist and a brilliant economic policymaker, and he's terrible at delivering the hard message at the same time, at least in political terms. So when Mario Draghi was asked this question about both defense industrial reorganization and enlargement. He just said, well, we'll have to do it, so we'll do it, right? And I think that doesn't sound as compelling as it should be, right? What you should know is that the European project has always been about doing things that are impossible to imagine, right? Getting the French and the Germans to come together and work as partners was impossible to imagine in the early 1950s, right? And yet, somehow they did that. Getting the French and Germans to do that within the context of NATO was impossible to imagine. But in the late 1950s, they did that as well. Getting the French and British to come together was impossible to imagine in the 1960s, but they figured out how to do that in the 1970s and 1980s. Getting East and West to come together was impossible to imagine, and in the early 1990s, they thought it would take decades and decades for that enlargement to take place, but it happened. So every time you say something is impossible, what you should know is that the European Union exists by dint of the fact that these things are not impossible. They're created by political will. The single currency is the best illustration. You may not like the euro. Everybody in Italy thinks the euro caused inflation. I'm not quite sure how they understand inflation and what they think inflation is. But it doesn't matter. The fact is that most economists said, you will never create a giant multinational currency. And you know what? They did. Then they said, oh, this thing will never work. And you know what? It did. It's not the most beautiful construct ever imagined, but it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to have the political will behind it. And enlargement, monetary integration, the completion of the internal market, all these great things that Europe has accomplished were things that nobody's ever done before. So why should we be afraid of doing something that's unprecedented when looking ahead?
It's good to have somebody who is optimistic about this. But I would also like to come to the next priority you have mentioned, the technology and economy, and mention a name again that you have mentioned already before, Mario Draghi, and the report, because this is very much dealing with these issues, like also the report of Enrico Letta. As far as I understand, this is pretty much the run sheet for the next European Commission, those two reports, and I think they are maybe not enough known and not enough discussed yet, at least in Austria. So please, could you explain a little bit what this all is about?
So whenever the European project is deeply threatened by the outside world, they always get two Italians to write reports. So in the 1980s, the two Italians were Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa and Paolo Cecchini. Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa wrote a report about the need to integrate Europe's markets in order to make sure that these markets were more efficient. Why? Because the Japanese and the Americans in the 1980s had much bigger markets to work with than European firms had. And because they had much better access to capital than European firms had. And because they had much more flexible labor regulations than European firms had. Or at least the Americans had more flexible labor relations. We could talk about Japanese labor relations if we have a separate meeting. But the fact of the matter is, in the 1980s, they were facing many of the same problems that we face today, except it was called Japan instead of China, but for the rest, right, the problems were very much the same. And so Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa said, we've got to do all of this integration. And Paolo Cecchini wrote a report that said, this is what will happen if we don't do it, right? The cost of non-Europe. How much will we give up? In the 1990s, we had a similar set of reports that came out. The first time the word competitiveness was mentioned was in a report by Jacques Delors that looked at growth, competitiveness, and employment. And the argument was, it's not just a question of integrating across national markets, it's also a question of liberalizing the way our labor markets work at the local level so that we can be as efficient as possible in our use of labor. Jacques Delors at the same time said we should also think about having common debt instruments at the European level so that we can begin to invest in infrastructure that crosses national boundaries. And we can begin to make the kinds of public goods at a European level that we would not ordinarily be able to afford nationally. The reason I say this is because it is now the 30th anniversary of that report on growth, competitiveness, and employment. And 30 years later, we have two new reports that are saying exactly the same thing. They're saying we need to have a little bit more common borrowing to produce enough finances for European public goods, but, and much more important, we need to make sure that we have good regulations. We need to make sure that we have good access to capital. We need to make sure that we are as efficient as possible in the way we use these things. There is one added wrinkle that came into this in the Draghi report, and that is the emphasis on innovation. We need to have the ability to bring a fixed amount of capital and a fixed amount of labor together, and without changing the amount of capital or labor, produce more stuff, right? The economic term for this is total factor productivity. You'll find that across the Draghi report, but what it means basically is we're going to use the same amount of inputs and we're going to produce more outputs. We're going to grow by dint of doing things differently and better. And this change is what Draghi argues is absolutely vital for us to achieve. And so he says we need to invest in innovation. There's a last thing that he says. The market is not going to do any of this automatically. And this is the crucial piece. Why? Because there are too many other distracting forms of investment, too many other ways to park money that are less productive than Europe requires. So we need to create the capacity for governments at the regional, national, and European level to help direct private sector investment to more productive and innovative areas of the economy. And when we do that, we have to recognize that not all parts of the economy are the same. We have some firms that face what we call diminishing marginal returns to scale. What that means is as they produce more, then each unit they produce becomes less and less profitable than the one before it. They have other firms that have increasing marginal returns to scale. It's where the more you produce, the more money you make off of each unit. That sounds very strange. What could that look like? That's what Facebook is. Facebook brings in a user, and when it has 2 users, those 2 users are not very valuable. When it has 50 users, each one is more valuable than 2, right? But if it had 1,000 users, each one becomes even more valuable than when it just had 50. And when it has 5 million users or 500 million users, then each user is even more valuable than when it just had 1,000. So as it adds more and more users, it becomes more and more valuable. That's what Facebook is, that's what Google is, that's what Microsoft is. The more users, the more valuable. Europe doesn't have any of those companies. But virtually every American oligarch right now owns a company like that. If you ask yourself where Jeff Bezos gets his money, it's from that kind of industry. By the way, Jeff Bezos gets more money parking web services and selling access to cloud computing than he does by selling books, right? Amazon Web Services is the real secret sauce that gives him wealth. And so when you look at things like that, you say, okay, we need to invest in those kinds of industries, right? But to invest in those kinds of industries, we have to change the way we think about investing money in Europe, to accept a bit more risk. And in order to accept a bit more risk, it might require a bit of public funding to encourage private money to go into that space. That's all he's saying. The third set of industries are those defense industries that we talked about earlier, where we want them to be concentrated, where we want them to become almost like monopolists, because we need them to be big, right? And so Draghi has a different formula for each of these three sectors of the economy, and those differences will effectively rewrite the way we think about the internal market in Europe. So it's a revolutionary prescription, but it's an important one to solve the economic problems of the day.
He also mentions a figure which has created a lot of stir when the report was published. He mentions a figure of 800 billion euros to be invested. And when you read the report closely, you find out that not all of this is going to be public money. How is the ratio? How is he thinking? What would be the public money and actually also the instruments for mobilizing the public money, and what could be leveraged with that?
So I think this is an important question. I mean, what we need is some public money to get lots of private investment, and lots of private investment to go into the right places. The private money is there, by the way. You wouldn't believe this, but much of that private money is parked in savings accounts that earn very little, if any, interest, because most Europeans keep a lot of money in savings. There's also money parked in pension accounts that, because of regulation, are meant to be virtually risk-free in the investments that they make, and so they earn very little of a rate of interest. And with an aging society, relying on savings and pensions is a dangerous formula, because we need that savings to grow. We need those pensions to grow, because they won't be supplemented by a large workforce. The workforce is going to be declining. So Draghi's argument is we need to change the regulation to make it easier for people to move their money out of savings and into productive investment, to make it easier for pensions to invest in riskier activities. And the state will absorb some of the risk associated with that, at least at the beginning, until they get better portfolios that have a higher risk-weighted rate of return, right? American pensions don't go bankrupt because they invest in venture capital and private equity. They make money. So how is it possible that they manage that risk? Well, they have a big diversified portfolio. What we need in Europe is to complete Europe's capital markets union, this is the jargon that you'll see, to make it easier to build big diversified portfolios so that you can get higher risk-weighted rates of return on your savings and on your pensions. And that's possible. And the more we succeed at that, the less public money becomes required to absorb the risk, because the market will be re-engineered to absorb that risk automatically. So the 800 billion should not be a scary number. By the way, you're investing that amount of money in the United States on an annual basis. It's just about making sure that those investments are made in Europe rather than on Wall Street, if you see what I mean. So, given that we want them to be made in Europe, the solution that Draghi's proposing is not to increase public debt, it's to use your savings more wisely for you, and to make sure that we have the right framework for you to get the most benefit out of that. And by the way, that's exactly the same argument that Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa was making in 1987. It's exactly the same argument that Alexander Lamfalussy was making in the end of 1999-2000. We have been making this argument for decades, but now it's time to do something about it and not wait any longer.
And there has also been some progress, but not the progress that was needed.
Far too slow. And as a result, and this is the part that I think most Europeans find disturbing, Europe used to invest all of its savings in Europe. So if you were to go back to 2006, 2007, Europe was investing all of its savings in Europe and productively, right? Then the financial crisis came, a financial crisis that started in the United States, and by the way, where Europeans were implicated because European banks were trying to get around the restrictions on the things that they could invest in, right? And they were using American assets to get a higher rate of return on their investments than they would otherwise get in Europe. But that's within portfolios that were otherwise balanced. After the financial crisis, Europe began running huge current account surpluses. That means they exported more than they import. And those huge current account surpluses, what the economists didn't tell you, were mirrored by huge exports of European savings to other countries. Because for the balance of payments to balance, if you export more than you import, you must be sending out more money to the outside world than you're receiving as investment from the outside world in the European context. And it was actually the savings that you were sending out that was driving the amount of goods that you were exporting. Because if you don't have the money, because you've sent all that money away, then you have to send the goods away too, right? Because you can't purchase them on the income that you make. These were arguments that took us many years to explain in the period from 2007 to about 2011, but now have become conventional wisdom, right? People accept these arguments. And what Mario Draghi is saying is we need to reverse that process, to use European savings domestically, and when we do, we'll stop exporting more than we import to the outside world, and that will not be a bad thing. That will be a good thing. We don't measure competitiveness by how much we export relative to how much we import. We measure competitiveness by how much value we can create using the same amount of capital and the same amount of labor. If we can combine those two things and create more value, then we're more competitive in this new way of thinking.
Contrary to what the two Italians did in the 1980s, there was a second report by Enrico Letta, and he didn't write about what would happen if nothing happened, but he also wrote a report about a very active European Union. Can you quickly also describe that?
So Enrico Letta's report is supposed to be on the single market, right? And he calls it more than just a market. And he's right. Because the single market is more than just a place where we buy and sell things. It's the place where we live. It's the place where we get the money to pay for the welfare state. It's the place where we ensure that we all get the education we want, not just in school, but as a lifelong learning process. It's the place where we ensure that people learn and have the opportunity to live with dignity. And if we're going to do all of these things, which is the unique special sauce that Europe has in organizing its life, the reason that I've been living here since 1988 is because you have a beautiful way of life in Europe, but it's a way of life that is expensive. And so what Enrico Letta is saying is we need to make sure that we re-engineer the internal market to be able to afford the way Europeans want to live. And he makes the same argument Mario Draghi makes in terms of, he calls it the savings and investment union, right? In terms of re-engineering the way we think about savings and investment so that we can ensure that we use the money we have wisely so that we can afford to live the way we want to live well into the future. Unlike Mario Draghi, Enrico Letta, in his report, also makes this argument about enlargement. He says enlargement is not just about security, it's also about prosperity. Because think about it. Look at the economy of Slovakia and go back to 2002. If you go back to 2002, you would find that the per capita income of Slovakia relative to the European average is about the same as the per capita income of Ukraine relative to the European average is today.
40%, something like that.
And then fast forward, Slovakia is actually very close to the European average today. I say this with Ambassador Carl, who was ambassador in Bratislava, who knows these figures better than I do. So Slovakia has grown dramatically and caught up. And as it did so, it actually generated a lot of business for Austria. Now imagine Ukraine, which is a much larger country. If Ukraine were to grow over the next 2 decades at the same pace and to the same degree that Slovakia grew over the last 2 decades, imagine the impact of a much larger economy with much greater natural resources and real industry and human capital. Imagine the impact that would have on Slovakia's economy, particularly the eastern part of Slovakia, which is basically the end of nowhere right now, but would be the road to Kyiv at some point in the future. And eastern Poland. These are low-income parts of Europe right now that we have to support with regional and structural funds that would grow considerably by dint of the economic activity in Ukraine. The Western Balkans is a very similar situation. The growth that we could unlock in Bosnia, in Serbia, in Montenegro, in North Macedonia, in Albania is considerable and would do great things for the Greek economy, for the Bulgarian economy, for the Romanian economy, for Hungary, and for Austria. So if we could, Letta argues, bring these countries in and give them the same opportunities that we gave to countries that joined in 2004, we would reap the benefits of doing so. And along the way, create opportunities for greater prosperity and security. Because think of all the critical raw materials that we would bring into Europe with this enlargement. And think of all of our ability to use those critical raw materials more productively, rather than having to worry about whether they're going to get cut off by sanctions imposed by some other country.
I think this is really interesting about those 2 reports, that they are telling an optimistic story of what we could do given the political will. There are many other things, especially in the Letta report, I find, because he even goes into the right. He compares the freedom to move with the freedom to stay, and says, well, we have to create the conditions for Europeans also to stay at the place where they want to stay, and not just to move to other places because there are economic conditions that would drive them away from home. He argues that there should be an investment in public housing. He argues also on institutional reform, and this is the third topic we were talking about as a priority for the European Union, to have some kind of, well, to work well with the institutions. If there is a reform necessary or not, I'm not so sure. Draghi, for example, at the end of his report says, well, we just need more political will and concentration, absent any political institutional reform, which we probably will not be able to muster in a very short time frame. Where do you see the political will coming together?
So first I want to stress, right, Enrico Letta is from the Democratic Party, but he actually comes from the Christian Democratic tradition. So he's not an old school Italian socialist. He comes from the left part of the Christian Democratic tradition, so it's socially conscious, but they're not social democrats. And
also not a catto-communist, as they used to say. Yeah.
And the reason that that's important is because Enrico Letta didn't come up with these ideas out of the ether. All of these ideas that you just talked about are in Jacques Delors' report from 1994. And Delors is the one who said, we need to make sure that people don't have to move, that they can find a job in their local community. We need to make sure that they have the social institutions that they require to lead a dignified life. And that makes sense because Jacques Delors is a real social democrat. So all of these social democratic ideas have actually been preserved, even by people who are not natural social democrats. And Mario Draghi is far from a natural social democrat, but he preserves these ideas as well. Why? Because the great strength of Europe lies in its social model. The European welfare state is not a barrier to competitiveness. It's the foundation for European competitiveness. It's where the innovation comes from. It's where we get the skilled human capital. It's where we get the ability to reproduce society rather than deplete society. And so even if they're written by non-social democrats, the social democratic ethos in these reports is strong. We just need to make sure that it gets unlocked. In doing that relies on our ability to imagine these reports and the priorities and policies they recommend succeeding. And imagining them succeeding is hard because, let's face it, it's a huge industrial transformation that we are having to undertake. Because it's not just about creating more innovation. Let's not forget, we're doing all this at the same time that we're trying to introduce these digital technologies. We're trying to master a whole new way of economic organization, and we're trying to fight climate change and reorganize our energy economy at the same time while fending off a big security threat. So it's a huge agenda, but it can be accomplished if we can just focus the political will, which is why this institutional piece of the story is so important. Let's not kid ourselves, though. It's not so important only at the European level. It's much more important at the national level, because the European Union is only as strong and effective as the weakest member state. And so in that sense, we have to face this crisis in our advanced industrial democracies, a crisis that we can at best describe and that we need to diagnose and address coherently.
I want to use the remainder of the time to ask you about an idea you developed in a piece a couple of weeks ago, which I find very fascinating. And it also relates to the issue we have not yet broached upon, which is the election results in the United States and the fact that probably the next inhabitant of the White House is not going to be such a big fan of the European Union as the gentleman right next to me. So you are developing a political strategy, basically, where you talk about what is in the Draghi and Letta report that could actually be attractive to Mr. Transactional President Trump.
So first, two things. We have a problem, and the problem is me, right? Because the most important thing about democracy is that you have to accept that you've lost in an election. And I'll be honest with you, I don't feel comfortable accepting that I lost the last election. I need to learn to feel comfortable with that because I have to trust in democracy. Even worse, I know that Donald Trump supporters did not feel comfortable when they lost the election in 2020. And that discomfort that we have losing elections is worrisome because it means that we are losing trust in democracy. We have to embrace that trust. And I don't know how to do that, to be honest. I'm struggling, right? The other thing is that we're electing politicians who don't want the political institutions to work. This is a problem. In the United States, the Republican Party has a huge group that actually has as its agenda to stop the political institutions from functioning. That's not a good agenda in my book. So we have to work with that. So what do? Particularly if we are Europe and not people with a Texas accent, right? The first thing is to try to look for opportunities. One opportunity is the Trump administration is coming in with a trade agenda that's based on what the president-elect describes as the most beautiful word he's ever heard, tariffs, right? And the idea that tariffs are the most beautiful word is very strange to me. But what Donald Trump is doing is he's actually applying these outmoded notions of competitiveness. He looks at Europe and he says, Europe exports far more than it imports. That's unfair. And so long as Europe exports more than it imports, I'm going to put tariffs on it, right? And so I went to some of the people around the Trump administration and I said, hey, what if we could make that problem go away simply by having Europe invest more? And what if Europe were not only going to invest more in industry, but also we're going to invest more in defense? What would you, Donald Trump, think? And they said, well, I think we could sell that to Donald Trump as a win-win, right? Because the current account surplus of Europe would go down, so it wouldn't look like Europe was being unfair. And at the same time, European defense expenditures would go up, so it wouldn't like Europe is not paying for its own security. So if Europeans actually embrace the Draghi report, then the two biggest irritants in the eyes of the Trump administration from Europe go away, all by themselves. And there's no need for tariffs anymore. And you know what? The people around Trump actually think this is not a bad idea. They think this is a good idea that they can sell to the president. So in an odd sort of way, President Trump creates the opportunity for Europe to do what Europe should do for its own benefit, while at the same time getting rid of a real potential threat to European economic security, because nobody wants to experience a trade war with the United States.
The only problem I see is looking at the Council conclusions of the European Council in Budapest, the informal European Council in Budapest, which was the last one when the heads of state and government met. And they praised the reports. They said all was wonderful and they wanted, obviously, all of this to happen. But when they talk about money, they say we will explore the development of new instruments and we will continue towards the introduction of new own resources. So this is exactly the crucial part of the machine, I think, that is still missing. And I don't know, what do you think? Will they muster the political courage in the next 12 months to do something about that? Because it's basically, this is the time when they have to start negotiating the next 7-year budget of the European Union.
So the short answer to your question is the first thing they're going to do is not going to be to issue more joint sovereign debt. That's just not going to happen quickly. But the long answer to your question is they can actually do a lot more than you imagine. And here I'll give you an illustration that comes out of that Delors report I keep referring to. You see, back in the early 1990s, when Jacques Delors wrote his report on competitiveness, the European Union had no responsibility for labor markets or employment. None. And economists would have told you the European Union has nothing to do with labor markets and employment. That's all at the national and regional level within countries. And you know what? After that, everybody said it wasn't going to happen, and then in 1997, they wrote an employment title into the Amsterdam Treaty, and then they created a process for sharing best practice in using active labor markets, the Luxembourg process, for improving labor market performance. And economists said, this is never going to help, but it did. And then they built on that success to come up with the Lisbon strategy that was supposed to make Europe the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy by the end of the decade. And it didn't work, but it got us a lot further than we ever expected. And so in that sense, you can say it's not going to happen, but that doesn't mean it isn't going to happen. And so a lot of what was written into the Delors report actually became not only bigger and more important than we expected, but also essential to the survival of the European project, which is what the former Social Democratic Dutch Prime Minister Wim Kok said in 2004 when he did his midterm review of the Lisbon strategy and said, we have to improve this strategy and make it work because the European social model is at stake. And so in that context, I think they will adopt and implement a lot of what is in the Letta and Draghi reports. And then they'll get to a point where they can't go any further without finding some way to work together to pay for it, which is exactly what happened with this whole debate about common debt. We started the debate about common debt in the 1990s when we were talking about joint infrastructure, and then we expanded that debate about common debt to look at these big, important projects of common interest. And then we started talking about it in the financial crisis to try to figure out ways to impose market discipline on governments. And we talked about it, and we talked about it, and we talked about it. And then when the pandemic, we finally did it, right? And we did a terrible job. I'll be honest with you. We could not have done a worse job designing those common debt instruments. We need to do better next time around. But that's okay. We always do it that way. We do something badly, we then fix it a little bit, and then we fix it again until we get it right. And that's what's going to happen. They're going to go back and figure out a better way to issue common debt. Why? Because you need it, right? Because there's only one way to protect the functioning of the internal market and achieve your objectives, and that's to work collectively. And it may not seem like it's likely right now, but for everybody who said the single currency was never going to happen, it did. For everyone who said joint and several debt was never going to happen, it did. So it's going to happen. It's just going to take a long time to get there. And this is the bad news. We don't have a long time. We need to move more efficiently, more quickly, more decisively. And so, although I want to be as optimistic as I can, I realize there's a lot of space to keep making these arguments and pushing people into more aggressive action because it's in Europe's interest to do so.
Professor Jones, we are very thankful to you for giving an optimistic view of what can happen in times where we don't listen to these kind of talks that often in terms of giving a positive outlook of political possibilities. Thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you.
Oh, helpful. That's great.